But we're going to switch gears here now, certainly to another case of exploitation, and that is the student debt crisis that is affecting, I think, basically everyone who has been to college in the past 20 or 30 years, certainly all the ones that I know. And we are very honored to be joined here by Sparky Abraham, who is the legal strategist for the Debt Collective. Sparky, thank you so much for being with us.
Thanks for having me.
Well, we're very happy to have you. And maybe just to set the stage, I think many people, perhaps one of them being my co-host, are wondering about what is actually going on with this student debt relief, because we're hearing a lot, but then there's all these rules and people are being ruled ineligible. I mean, what exactly was decreed by the Biden administration, and where are we in terms of the debt relief, I guess, big picture?
Big picture, things are still on track for the broad-based debt relief. And I think part of the confusion here is there are a bunch of different programs with a bunch of different requirements going in a bunch of different directions. But if we're talking about the big broad-based relief, which is $10,000 or $20,000, depending on if you received a Pell Grant, that is still, for the most part, on track. The couple wrinkles there are that for folks who had older loans who did not consolidate before the end of September, they have to some extent been written out for now. Which is not a move that I'm a fan of, but was part of a response to some of the lawsuits. And then those lawsuits also so far have been widely unsuccessful, but there is right now an administrative stay, which is to say no court has found that this plan is illegal, but they've basically said, okay, we'll just hold on for a week while we get some expedited briefing. That's in place right now, but that's not going to be in place by the time the cancellation actually starts happening, which won't happen for another few weeks anyway. So the application, such as it is, a very, very short application for the $10,000 or $20,000 of relief is still open. I think around 20 million people have filled it out so far. Strongly encourage folks to go fill it out. There's really not much to lose.
It's interesting because there's the one thing that changed kind of after it had been announced in order to prevent certain lawsuits from succeeding was the issue of what kind of loan you had. And it was, there's some of these loans that have just been sold to so many different loan servicers that even if they were government subsidized loans, they suddenly are being serviced by some private company like Navient or something. That's one of the bigger ones that keeps getting mentioned. So it made all of these people who have, none of it was their own fault. They just, now these are loans that don't qualify. So that's one thing that's been quite confusing that I know a lot of people, myself included, have questions about what that means exactly. And then the other thing that I've seen, and these are very selfish questions on my part, but I know there's lots of other people who have them as well, because I've seen a lot of the Twitter chatter and online chatter about this. We've
all got the same questions.
Right. Is the other issue too, is there's been this bizarre advice that I haven't seen from any government website of if you paid any loans after the moratorium or was in place after 2020, you can actually apply to get that reimbursed and then have those forgiven. But these are just random people saying this in news articles. So, I mean, can you speak to those two issues? Because that's what I'm confused about. I know a lot of other people are.
Yes. So the first thing that you mentioned was sort of the servicer changes. And that has been very confusing for a long time. And part of the issue and a lot of what some of the current actions are meant to address is the fact that not only have servicers been changing and switching around for years, but they've also just been giving people horrible information for a very long time. Navient is a prime example of that. The federal government has been in a lawsuit against Navient for several years now for misleading student borrowers, all the while still paying Navient to service federal student loans, which is absurd beyond belief. In terms of this particular relief, who your servicer is doesn't really matter as much as what type of loan you have, particularly whether you have a federal direct loan as opposed to a guaranteed loan. And the time period for that generally is like pre-2010. You're more likely to have guaranteed loan. If you got your loan after 2010, you're almost certain to have a direct loan. And the sort of cutoff that they introduced was they said that as of September 29th, anyone who had a guaranteed loan would not get the $10,000 or $20,000 relief. And the reason for that, I mean, we can get into it if you want. It's a little bit complicated, but basically just the federal government is not the owner of those loans. Somebody else is the owner of those loans. And the owners of those loans are at least somewhat involved in the lawsuits. And so that was just kind of like a stopgap to say, like, okay, let's try to shut these lawsuits down by introducing this limit. Personally, I don't think that was necessary or wise, and I think it wrote a lot of people out of relief that they absolutely deserve. But that's what's happening. That's what's happening there. It doesn't necessarily have to do with who your servicer is or anything like that. It's what type of loan you have, which kind of comes down to how long you've had it in some cases. In terms of the refund, it is true. It is true that if you have a loan that is eligible for the COVID payment pause, which tend to be direct loans, those ones issued after 2010, and you made payments anyway, you can call your servicer and get a refund of those payments. Now, for whom will that be beneficial? I mean, it's going to depend on people's individual circumstances, but I would say if you are slated to have your loans canceled, either through the broad-based relief or through public service loan forgiveness or something else, might as well go get that refund and have that amount canceled instead. I think there are good and bad reasons why the Department of Education isn't necessarily touting that fact, but it is a fact. People are doing it.
Well, I think that's crucially important information. And I mean, there's just so many different angles to this, and I think that, and I'm, praying for everyone to get the maximum amount of debt relief possible. But I think even for people who have their loans forgiven, for people who have, large amounts of just strictly private loans, there's one, I don't know if it's legal, but it certainly feels moral element of just outright predatory lending. I can remember when I took out my first student loan and they asked me where I was going to live, and I was saying maybe on campus. And they basically convinced me to take out another $20,000 to live off campus and how cool it would be to live off campus. And now every time I pay, I'm just like, I can't believe that they said this. I was like an 18-year-old, 19-year-old kid. And it just feels that, there's I don't know, that there's something about this that was just so unjust and so immoral to this student debt crisis that even beyond this relief, that so much more has to be done, not just to relieve people, but I don't know, to hold someone accountable for this.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that the whole idea of student debt, if you just take a step back from our current context and think about this, it is mind-bogglingly unjust, right? Like I am in debt because I wanted to have an education and did not have rich parents who could pay for it. And so that's now going to follow me for decades of my life. And I'm going to be paying interest, and I'm going to be, kept in my job for fear of leaving and kept out of the housing market, et cetera, right? All of these consequences down the line. When, my view and the debt collective's view is that education is a public good. Right? There's no reason we should be doing this any differently from how we do primary or secondary education. Education should be free and open for all. And to the extent that we need to, offset the cost of that, we do it through taxes. We socialize this good. The benefits of education are socialized. And so the cost of it should be too. That's the heart of this. And so our call is still, and always has been, cancel all of the debt and make all education free. That being said, even the idea that we would get any federal debt cancellation was truly laughable in mainstream circles just a few years ago. People really laughed at it. John Oliver had a whole segment laughing about it. And so I think the fact that we're seeing even this limited relief is really a victory for the activists who've been working on this for years and struggling over it, and a proof of concept, which is to say, look, they can't say they can't do this anymore. They obviously can do it. They're doing it. And from our perspective, we need to bring that to the rest of student debt, and we need to bring that to a bunch of other debt too. We need to bring that to medical debt. We need to bring that to housing debt. We need to bring that to criminal legal debt. All of these types of debt are unjust. They're imposed on people because those people don't have the means to live, and they have to go into debt just to live their lives. And it's time for some action.
Well, I'm glad you mentioned that too. And one of the things I've always appreciated about the Debt Collective and how you all have approached this is also sort of the socializing of struggle, if you will, and the impact that debtors as a united force really have. And I was hoping you could speak to that, because I think a big part of debt, which is so tied to shame, is how individualized everyone is about it. You don't want to talk about it, you don't want to admit it, but most of us are suffering from it.
Yeah, absolutely. One of our favorite little quotes, which was, I think, originally from J. Paul Getty, right, is, if you owe the bank $100,000, the bank owns you. If you owe the bank $100 million, you own the bank. And so individually, our creditors essentially own us. We're powerless against them as individuals. But collectively, all together, we are their entire existence. We are all of their assets, and we can actually exert a lot of control. So that's the idea behind the debt collective, behind having a union of debtors, is that even though we don't have much power as individuals, we have a great deal of power collectively that we can exert. So yes, that's the idea behind the debt collectives organizing. That looks different in different contexts. Sometimes it looks like shifting the narrative and changing people's ideas about things, like on federal student debt. Other times it might look like exerting some direct pressure, and hitting an entity in its pocketbooks, whether that's people who owe money to a certain hospital coming together and taking action, or to a certain company, to a certain debt buyer. All of these things are sort of the possibilities of organized collective action on behalf of debtors that structurally look very similar to what you'd see, when you're looking at labor unions, or when you're looking at tenants unions. These are all situations where people, if they come together, can exert a lot more power. I'm glad you raised the shame point, because I think that is one of the big obstacles. And one of our favorite activities to do are debtors' assemblies, where we get folks together and just talk about our debt and talk about the way that it's affected us. We had one of these, I think last week. It really stuck with me, because a woman who was there, she had been in student debt for decades. And this was her second debtors' assembly. And she said after the first debtors' assembly that she went to, she actually went and told her sister that she had student debt for the first time. And her sister told her for the first time that she also had student debt. And, they'd both been struggling with this privately for decades and didn't even know it about each other. So it really is, it's powerful. It can be a weight lifted for people. And then once you lift the weight and come together, then we can start flexing some power.
And on that like related note, what can people who are watching do? Because obviously this isn't enough, right? This is this sort of like one-time forgiveness for a lot of people, but not everyone. And then it doesn't do anything about the fact that this student loan issue is going to continue for the foreseeable future, because people today are still taking out student loans. So obviously the activism around this is not anywhere near to complete. So where would you recommend people go? What should people do if they want to get involved on this issue?
Yeah, so folks should go to debtcollective.org and join the union, first of all. If you're able to pay dues, you can pay dues. If you're not able to pay dues, you don't have to pay dues. You can join the union, join our member Slack, come to a new members meeting, come to a debtors assembly, get involved. This is a people power movement. This isn't some, we're doing our best not to be brains in the cloud sort of directing this stuff, but we need ideas and we need energy from folks who are in debt. And it is a very fun and energizing space. So I would love for anyone listening who's interested to come join us, come to a meeting, come check it out. And then I would also say, just to your point about the fact that federal student debt is going to continue to be a problem, one of the things that I've been really disturbed by is the industry of private student debt refinancing. And these companies like SoFi and Laurel Spring and these other companies that will tell you, you should refinance out of your federal student debt because we'll give you a better interest rate and you'll money. That is a very, very limited view of what it means to be in student debt. And what folks do when they refinance is they essentially hand over their political leverage and no longer are able to benefit from any of the political action that they can collectively force from the federal government on federal student debt. And so I would also encourage people just to be thoughtful about that and to recognize that you do have some power as a federal student debtor to exercise leverage against your creditor. It looks very different. It's not to say you don't have power to exercise leverage against SoFi, but that's different, and it might be hard to advise.
Mm-hmm. Debtcollective.org, debtcollective.org. That's the site. Go there. Sparky Abraham from the Debt Collective. Really appreciate you joining us here on the Freedom Side.
Thank you so much.